Good afternoon, everybody. This is Winter, and I'm joined by Aegis, and we're the Glacial Shield podcast. Today, we're going to discuss the rise of indie games. Now, I'm not going to lie, this is going to be majorly an Aegis topic. I have some experience, but not a ton. And so, we're going to rely pretty heavily on what he has to say today. You're going to hear less of me for once.
Thank
Let's go
God.
through the content. Thank God, thank God. We're going to go through the contents just real briefly about what we want to say throughout the day. First, we're going to talk about the indie games we played. Then we're going to talk about proto indie games. So this is before indie games came around. What was there if you didn't want to play AAA games? Then we're going to talk about the fall of AAA games, and basically why did this vacuum open up that allowed indie games to develop. Then we're going to talk about why indie games are growing in and of themselves. What are their merits? What are some of their detractions? Then we're going to discuss what's next, i.e., what's going to happen with indie games this year, next year, and onwards into the future. Then we very briefly want to talk about what can we do to help indie games. Everyone wants to help the little guy, so we're going to make some suggestions on how you can do it. Not that we don't think you already know what you can do to help them. All right, Aegis, let's kick this off with indie games that we've played. Go ahead.
Cool. Okay, so for me, these are all to varying degrees, but I've played Among Us, No Man's Sky, Super Meat Boy, Hades, Hollow Knight, Salt and Sanctuary, a little bit of Ori, Cuphead, Terraria, and Starbound, and a lot of Shovel Knight. What about you?
So I won't lie, I played Flash games and things when I was a kid, which we will get into more detail about when we get to proto indie games. But I took a pretty long break from video games around the time that indie games got popular. I've recently gotten back into playing video games, and I will admit that the only indie game I've downloaded is Among Us, and I enjoy it quite a bit. I also have witnessed some Super Meat Boy, and I've seen YouTubers play through some indie games that, while I'll admit I had an interest in, I didn't get to play myself just because of the time frame and what was going on in my life. So I'm going to be leaning on you a lot today to walk me through the benefits of indie games and the enjoyment of them. Is that all right?
Lean on me. Yeah, of course it's fine. We'll
Fair
see.
enough. All right. So we're trying to keep our intros a little shorter, guys. We want to get into the meat of our conversations a little quicker. Let's hop right into proto indie games. I think I can kick this one off. I'm going to date myself and say I remember back in the day when you had to sneak onto Newgrounds or Miniclip without your parents noticing.
Do you
And
remember Newgrounds
I
was kind
think
of like porn?
no, it wasn't that. It was adult learning for teenagers, um, or I guess pre-teenagers at some points. But anyway, I can remember when these flash games were sort of the rage. It was a big deal to get on in school and be able to play something like Bubble Trouble, Tanks, Snowball Fights on Newground, and they had a lot of the characteristics that I think of when I think indie game. They were kind of grindy, they were kind of low quality, visuals wise, and they had pretty high difficulty spikes, which Aegis, again, with not a lot of experience, I would say that kind of signifies what a modern indie game typically looks like. Would you agree?
Depends on the game, but that's one common thread, yeah.
Right. Well, and that's what I think of when I think of in proto indie games. I just want to kind of remind people these sort of things have been around for a lot longer than most of us remember. And some of the games of these days that we wouldn't maybe consider AAA, but we would consider popular games actually started off in this proto indie game realm, which Aegis, I think you played at least one of them a lot when you were a kid. Want to talk about it?
Which one's that, RuneScape or Tibia?
Or both, whichever one you feel like is the best example.
Oh man, I remember back when I was like 7 years old, my friend Zach, he was like, "Hey man, you gotta play this game. It's called RuneScape," and I'm pretty sure it was a very simple Java game. I'm almost fairly certain it still is Java, but it's you make a character, you can grind up like stats, you can fight different monsters, do quests, like make your own armor or kill monsters or other players to get armor. It's a really fun loop. And I mean, thinking of it today, you wouldn't think of RuneScape as like an indie game, but it started off with two brothers, I believe, in their parents' basement when they were mid 20s in England, and it's grown to have, I believe, hundreds of people developing both old school RuneScape and RuneScape 3. So it's kind of ballooned over the last, oh geez, it's close to 20 years, I think. Wow.
And
Wow, I'm
and it's
old.
funny. Yeah, I wouldn't age yourself too clearly on here. We don't want the video game crowd realizing we're older than them. We might lose potential viewers.
Right?
But I would say it's funny though when I think of RuneScape. I think that indie games sometimes um, they get aped by AAA games, but RuneScape's a game where I almost see it as these days people see it as a AA, AAA game, and they're rooting for the little guy like Valheim to basically beat out RuneScape. And it's funny to look back on it and realize RuneScape used to be the David to the AAA's Goliath. And now RuneScape is kind of seen as that Goliath, whereas something like Valheim is seen as the David. And that just shows you that there's almost this bubble that they work in that once they get too big, people stop seeing them as indie games. I mean, I was going to say think Five Nights at Freddy's, but I guess we'll get there when we start talking about modern indie games. But I just think it's funny to see some of these ones that we remember as being very off the beaten track, and nowadays they're seen as the mainstream games.
Well, that was one game you could
Um,
actually access through Miniclip back in the day too, right? You could either access it through Miniclip or just on Jajex's like website.
yeah, but I think maybe the most important point we're trying to get to right now is that these games that were on these websites that basically made their money through ads, they kind of brought about what we see in modern indie games. We see that kind of easy base to get in, but much higher skill levels capable to get through the game. And we also see kind of that lack of focus on visual glamour and more focus on I don't want to say just fun, but almost like addictive gameplay, very much designed to get at your base feedback loop of, ooh, I did good. Ooh, I did good. Um, and wanting to keep doing it. I think that's pretty common in modern indie games, if I'm not wrong, Aegis.
Well, I just think of four games that are kind of similar-ish. You got Hollow Knight, Salt and Sanctuary. I mean, even Cuphead, and you've got Shovel Knight. Now, like they all operate on like they're all 2D games, and they're varying degrees of platformers, and there's difficulty spikes. There's like tough bosses. There's gear you can collect. There's reasons to explore levels, and there's rewards for finding the secret gear. There's rewards for beating levels flawlessly, beating levels that taking any damage from bosses. There's a lot of risk and reward in these games too, and I think that's a lot of like just a lot of like credence just how successful they are because it's like you feel good when you beat like a boss in Salt and Sanctuary because it's considered like a 2D Souls game. You beat the boss,
Right.
you you put the head on a stick, use it as a sword, and it feels kind of cool to do that.
I could see the entertainment in that. You might need to show me that game after this. All right, so now that we've kind of laid the groundwork of both of our experiences with indie games, which again, mine is pretty much zero, and Aegis's is quite extensive, and we've laid out the basis of where we think indie games came from, let's talk about the elephant in the room, and that means the big guy, the Goliath. Why exactly has Goliath or AAA games fallen? What do you think, Aegis? Start us off.
Because they got too goddamn greedy.
That's one way to put it. Want to embellish on that, or are you just planning on just full mic drop with that?
No. So, I mean, obviously, games make a lot of money. And obviously, shareholders and the big wigs at companies like money. We all like money, but games for a lot of time operated out of this in this realm almost where like there was almost like an equal balance between making money but also putting out a decent game. Because back in the day, if your N64 cartridge launched and there was bugs, there was no day one patch. Your game was bugged. Your game was almost screwed, and it was going to be labeled like a failure or like a flop at launch because it was buggy. Well, nowadays, you could send updates out day one. Uh, there's a lot of like ways for companies to bob and weave around issues with games and to put out updates and patch fixes and stuff. So there's a lot more room for failure nowadays because of just technology. But I mean,
I,
with the costs of things like making games and developing games increasing, uh, companies trying to make more money need to make more money in spite of just the increasing costs. So you see that in kind of like microtransactions, uh, half-baked games being put out, or like beta games that stay in beta, like PUBG for instance, which is I think still in beta, but it's still marketed as like almost like a fully priced game, right? It's kind of pathetic.
Yeah, the infinite beta loop. Yeah, that's a thing nowadays. It's awful.
There's a space game too. It's kind of like a Elite Squadron or uh, Elite Dangerous, but it's in space and it's been in beta, I believe, for like 5 or 6 years, and I can't remember the name of it, but it's almost a meme. Like the game's never going to be launched in full time.
No Man's Sky. Yes.
No, 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 not No Man's Sky. That game rebounded, but that's something we'll talk on soon.
Right. So I think you kind of hit on the biggest point is these big developers got fairly greedy. I want to get a little more into what I think happened with the nitty gritty of why that greed impacted things. First, I want to talk about the shift towards monotony that I think a lot of people began to see in AAA. I think big developers began to realize what the masses wanted, and they began to take less risks and allow less risks from the people who were developing them. And then alongside that, I think they started to focus more on the glamour and the pixel race than they did on the actual content of the game. And I just think that led to people beginning to look for alternatives. I think people started to see past playing the same shooter through 10 different ways, the same sports game 10, 15 times. And companies started having these really short development cycles of only a year. I'm thinking things like FIFA, things like Call of Duty Black
Oh,
Ops.
Call of Duty
It,
especially. I was just gonna say that right now. Call of Duty.
right. It led to that almost to me it led to that clue in and that realization that wait a minute, I'm literally paying for the same thing over and over and over again. And one of my favorite games of all time, which would have been Halo, even started to mimic Call of Duty. And it got to the point where I think people realized even though these games are looking nicer and nicer each generation, they're incrementally looking better, playing smoother. At the core, they weren't changing. Companies were running for 10, 15 years with the exact same design content, and very little actual growth.
It's like a
Um,
nice, beautiful home with cheap IKEA furniture.
exactly. And I think one of the biggest points that they got into with trying to appease the masses was they took away difficulty spikes. And Aegis, I know that you've played some of these really difficult indie games. I know you're a Dark Souls fan. I think that one of the biggest things they forgot was a lot of more hardcore gamers like the challenge, and indie games began to embrace that challenge. What do you think? Do you got any more thoughts on why AAA games kind of lost their polish?
Well, I think of like Halo, Gears of War, Call of Duty. When these games started to kind of, I believe, like the industry, like or the developers started to fall or dip in quality, is they were on their fourth, fifth, even sixth iteration or version of game, right? Like there's gonna be obviously natural burnout from the developers, but the owners, the publishers still want to make the money. They still need to make money. And then,
Right,
if you can remember from Halo 4, Halo 4 was honestly largely inspired by Call of Duty. You had the loadout systems, you had different perks, you had like the drop pods with gear that came in for like almost like kill scores, which was not Halo at all. It really shaped up like the meta for spawning into games. So like in that aspect, originality for video games started to kind of like depreciate too, and it didn't feel like Halo in that case. It felt like a COD game. Uh,
well, it's funny that you said that because I've been playing the Master Chief Collection lately, and one of the more interesting sides of it is that you can play playlists that have Halo 1 to Halo 4. And what I've realized is, yeah, there's that nice patch where you've got Halo Reach where they took some risks. But then, like when I play Halo 4's multiplayer, I actually find it less enjoyable than Halo 2's. It There's something about it that rings very hollow. And even though it's faster and it's glossier, something about it seems less. I'm sorry, that was a cut in, but it's something odd I've noticed, and I can't even put my thumb on it.
Well, it's almost like if you
Carry on.
include like in that game, that's not where they introduced sprint, but that's where sprint started to be like almost like a core mechanic of the game because in Reach it was like a loadout, but you could also have like the jump pack, the armor lock, the dodge. But sprint, all characters had sprint in Halo 4, and it made maps, if you weren't sprinting, it made them feel smaller, or it made them feel too big, and it was like you had to sprint in order to get away from enemies if you were low health or shields. There's a lot of changes in Halo 4 that were kind of like that's kind of like the ugly duckling, and it didn't blossom into a swan.
That's fair, and I apologize for cutting you off. That was a tangent that I guess I wanted to go on without realizing I wanted to go on. Go back to what you were saying.
No, I mean another area where like like, big AAA games fell is kind of like appealing to the masses and trying to like spread like their net too thin to appeal to more people to make more money. But then in doing that, kind of like we see with Halo 4, you start to stray away from the core values of what made Halo Halo. So it didn't feel like it, like you said, to shoot the BR. It didn't feel like, the Halo 2 or the Halo 3 BR. It felt like something really alien.
Right,
And
and even games like Dead Space wanted to be Call of Duty. They gave up fear. They
yep,
gave up the core content of scaring people to be more like a shooter that they weren't really supposed to be.
yeah, exactly. I don't know if you played Gears of War Judgment, did you?
No, I did play through, I think, up to Gears 3, but again, that after that, that was kind of that period where I stopped playing.
So I mean, Gears 1 to 3, they were fairly decent games. I liked them a lot, and the multiplayer was unreal. But everyone told me Gears of War Judgment sucked, and I'm sorry if you liked it. I was like, you know what? It can't be that bad. It has to be decent. And they took the campaign, and it was almost like an arcadey flashback story mode where, you had to get a certain amount of points by killing ads in certain ways in order to proceed or gain like an end score. And this is reaching back to almost a decade ago, but I'm sorry if it's shoddy, but that's just the general gist. I remember just not even beating the game, which when I was younger, when you're a kid, you're on the cheap. You don't have any money. It's your parents that get you the shit. And
Right.
even having a little rinky-dink job at Tim Hortons, you're not making a lot of money, so the games you buy, you're more likely than not going to finish them. That's one I didn't finish, and it just really soured my taste for the genre or for Gears for a while.
Yeah, and I guess at the end of the day, a lot of people were seeing what we're saying right now. There was not diversity. The things that were coming out were rushed, unpolished, unfinished, even though they looked glamorous. AAA games just became a competition to get the money as fast as possible in the pockets. And while they're still growing at a rapid pace, I suspect that if they had taken their time a little bit and kept the market under their control, that exponential growth of production value and earnings probably would be even steeper than it is now. Now, with that being said, I'm not one of those people that likes to look at somebody's win as being purely because somebody else lost. So now that we're done kind of beating on the big guy, let's talk a little bit about the little guy. Why exactly, Aegis, do you think indie games are growing on their own merits and on the merits of the people who support them?
Well, coming from somebody who has played both, it's pretty easy to see why one wins where the other loses. Just general burnout, not only as a developer making streamlined and similar games, but also as somebody who is a fan of these games that were streamlined. Now it's kind of like, you know, my old game isn't quite the game that I like to play anymore. I'm looking for something different. And indie games, a lot of them are new. They're, featuring heroes and villains you don't know, new universes to get into. Like it's new, it's fresh, and it's not so highly corporatized most of the time where it feels like the developers can make their own story, carve their own path. You can feel the love, and it, like you were saying before, it like sometimes like the looks quite aren't there for indie games. Like some of them, like Cuphead, it looks like it's from the 20s and 30s, and it looks beautiful, but it's not like realistic looking, kind of like The Last of Us Part 2. It it's fit for its time, so it doesn't actually have to crutch on like the looks department and the graphics. It's you're playing the game for the content. You're playing it for the story, for the mechanics, for the boss fights, for the levels, the upgrades. Like it's you're
Yeah,
playing. It's more so you're playing a game now for what made you like games in the first place. Like, is it fun to play?
What are the Easter eggs? What are the little secrets I can find? I can see that.
Yeah.
Now, I guess because I don't have that background, I want to touch base on the view from the outside. Some things that I've seen about not necessarily indie games, but their supporters. I think the advent of Steam and high profile YouTubers has had a meteoric impact on the gaming industry. I think Steam has opened up this new realm where the middleman, who I guess would be the guy sitting at the office table in a boardroom, gets cut out. You almost let these indie publishers go straight to the people who might be playing the game and say, "Hey, take a look at our game." As long as they meet some of Steam's requirements for what's allowed and not allowed to be in a game, but it allows that level of interaction that where you might have a boardroom say, well, that's a risk we don't want to take, or your game doesn't look good enough, or even, hey, your game might be profitable, but it's going to be a niche market that isn't valuable enough to put out things like ads, put out things like promotion. Steam allows people to self promote. And it also allows something that I wanted to touch on so bad during the fall of AAA games, but I felt like it fit better here. It allows the gamer to be the reviewer. And unlike, say, Metacritic, which has begun to censor individual reviews for fair reasons or unfair reasons, depending on what side of the board you're on, when you go on Steam, you are seeing what people have to say about a game that have played the game. And generally, it has worked out pretty well. A lot of games that never would have ever seen the light of day have all of a sudden been pushed into the limelight and have been hugely successful because people told one another, hey, this game is good. And you pair that with what a lot of people see as the fall of trust in actual paid reviewers whose jobs depend on being sent things like a pre-review or what do they call them? Reviewable version of
Like
the
a
game.
review copy.
Right. And that lack of trust, because you know that if someone reviews an EA game poorly, they might not get the next EA game that comes out to review, and they might lose their pay, which is all very fair. Could also lead to unfair ratings that are ballooned just to make sure they continue to get their stream of work. And I think when you pair those things side by side, when people go on Steam, they have more faith in a rating system, and it also allows things to be rated that would normally not have been rated. I think you also get the side of it of YouTubers. Now, do I think YouTubers are always playing indie games for purely holistic reasons? No. I think that they're trying to increase their profit margin as much as they can by buying a cheap $10, $15 indie game versus a $100 AAA game, and then playing it over 15, 20, 30 sessions. I mean, I've seen YouTubers who've played over 100 episodes of Happy Wheels, and man, they must be getting their money back on that purchase. Versus AAA games, where especially if they're playing through the single player story, often they only get 10 videos. But with that being said, they also get the brownie points of supporting the little guy. And while I believe some YouTubers do use their platform purely to try to promote the little guy, even the ones that aren't doing it for that reason and are trying to do it for the profit margins, at the end of the day, they're still supporting the little guy. They're still helping with that development of these games and the promotion of these games, the marketing of these games that they never would have gotten from a AAA publisher like EA. And I think that's a big deal because more and more people see it, more and more people are willing to try it, and then more and more people go on and rate it and say, hey, this is actually a pretty fun game, leading to that snowball effect of, I think you called it word of mouth earlier. And that word of mouth goes straight to the source rather than getting cut off by the middleman of a big publisher. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, just think of this past year during the quarantine. Like, Among Us and Fall Guys both just ballooned. And I mean, Among Us especially, that was like a game that was, what, 2 to 3 years old. Maybe had 20 to 30 people playing concurrently. and then all of a sudden a couple of streamers get bored, and the game like just skyrockets in popularity and becomes like the talk of the town for. I believe it's still big for people to watch on like Twitch and YouTube gaming.
I play it. I
Yeah,
won't lie.
exactly. You still
I
play it.
enjoy it.
It's fun.
Yeah, I enjoy
Like
it.
like a lot of times with indie games, you see that the games are cheaper than their AAA like similar or counterpart. Like, you can play Hades, which is basically it's a roguelike game, kind of like Diablo, where it's like dungeon crawling and stuff. And I believe you can get that for like $30. And to get a full like Diablo 3 with Reaper of Souls DLC and any new expansions, whatever they have, I don't know. It's probably I think $50 to $70. And you know, uh, Hades is an indie developer, came out in 2018, and the game has just been massively successful. People love playing the game. It's more credence just how polished and how nice it is to play a game that's not AAA developed, but also not being governed by a massive publisher whose bottom line is their bottom dollar.
Right. And I think the fact of the matter is that it's easier to take a risk on a cheaper game. I mean, there are games that are worth $100, and there are indie games that probably people would have paid more money for once they'd actually played it and enjoyed it. Um, but having that lower price point encouraged people to give it the chance. And I think that kind of leads into what I one more thing I wanted to touch base on this
Same.
is freemium games. I think freemium games are a big part of the indie push, and especially on phones. I told you before that I am not someone who necessarily picks at microtransactions in general, but especially in small indie games, I see a microtransaction as being a great thing. You pick up something that's free, put out by an indie publisher, you play it for 20, 30 minutes, and you go, hey, this is good. Oh, they want me to spend $5 to buy 100 crystals. I'm making up things, but 100 rupees or whatever their version of in-game currency is, and all of a sudden, you kind of consider wanting to give them that money. Now, can you get people who get highly addicted to that and spend way too much money? Yes. But do I think it's a good thing that you can almost pick up a game for free and then choose to give them a bit of money when you feel like they've earned it? I also feel like that's a good thing. And even if you don't wind up paying the publisher because you downloaded the game and you just don't have the spare money, they can still get the word of mouth of you downloaded the game and told 20 of your friends, hey, that's a pretty good game. I enjoyed it. It's free marketing. And I think on phones, especially with things like Angry Birds, which am I remembering wrong that Angry Birds didn't have microtransactions, but it had a paid version that had more stuff in it?
First off, it's free real estate. Second off, I don't think there's any microtransactions in Happy Bird at all or Flappy Bird. Happy Bird.
Was it abs? Was it ads?
Yeah, there's ads. Yeah.
Oh, okay, so then they made their money off ads, but that's even better. They entirely were word of mouth, and they became huge, and they made their money, I guess, through ads. I thought that there was a paid for version of Angry Birds, but it doesn't matter. Either way, they got their money through word of mouth and through putting out a game that people were entertained by. And while it drew in the casual crowd, it still had that difficulty spike for people who actually wanted a challenge. And that's the way I find a lot of the indie games are. You brought up Among Us, and one of the things I enjoyed about Among Us is it was really easy to get into and learn, but then it had a pretty good difficulty spike in terms of learning how to win and the different styles that you could play with. And it was just fun. Even though it could be hard, it could be frustrating, it was an entertaining game. And I assume that's why people like Super Meat Boy as well. I've seen some gameplay. The basics look pretty easy to understand, but then you actually have to learn how to use those basic gameplay mechanics to win the game, which I hear is a lot harder.
Pause. But
Did you
okay,
say pause?
I did say pause because you said I heard it's a lot harder.
So,
It's an innuendo. Anyways, Winter, come on, keep up. Okay, so let's.
oh wait, we're not. Oh wait, we're not paused. I thought you paused the actual.
No.
Oh, well, then I should
This,
just drop
this
your
is
full name and address on here.
this is staying in. I don't care.
Fair
Okay, now
enough. Okay.
let's. Okay, so earlier, I think we both agreed that typically indie games are cheaper and they also typically have high quality content. Now, I'm going to take you back. I think it was to 2015 or 2016. Do you remember when No Man's Sky was being first like advertised on the PlayStation 4 and it was being hyped up to be the next big thing? Do you remember that?
Yes, and I still don't know if No Man's Sky actually counts as an indie game or not, but yes.
It did back then, at the very least. I'm pretty sure Hello Games had, I think, 12 to 15 people that were developing the game, and it was the only game they were making, and it was being hyped up by Sony to being one of the biggest up and coming games. And to their credit, the game had a lot of like, I believe, uh, like state of the art or upcoming new technology because like their software could, I believe, generate upwards of 18 quintillion planets in the game and wildlife and fauna and environments that were different from planet to planet. It all sounded really
Yep.
cool on paper, right? Exploring the space, and there wasn't really a story, which is sometimes it's kind of common with indie games. You just go in and you do shit, and like you look at like Rust or Minecraft originally didn't have a story. It was just it's like you go in there and you, the sandbox is your oyster. But when the game launched, it was empty, it was barren, it was hyped up to be more than it was. You know, there was like people were told that you could like see your friends in the game, uh, and it was marketed as a fully priced PS4 game. And what happened, I believe, like within the first week of launch, there was a lot of refunds for the game, but this is where a developer sticks with the game because they believe in it. Hello Games, over the course of years and years, to the point of now, the game is actually a very successful and fun game to play. It did like almost a complete 180. Hard to believe.
Well, they got the money injection, right? They
They
got
got the
something
money
they didn't
injection.
have off the bat.
They got the preliminary fan base built up, and they stuck with their product. They didn't just give it up like we're seeing possibly with, say, Anthem from EA and BioWare. You know, Anthem was a flop. It was empty. There was too much of a stingy loot system in the game. By the way, Anthem is a looter shooter kind of game, in case you weren't sure. But you know, the game was basically put on pause because so many fans just did not like it. There were so many promises, and it was not up to what it was supposed to be. And for the past year, I believe like an Anthem 2.0 was being worked on, and I believe there was a hearing or like an earnings call recently with EA and BioWare and other shareholders. And did I say shareholders? Shareholders, not shareholders. But yeah, so I believe people in the community aren't sure if the game's going to be completely shelved because to put all that effort and energy into trying to revitalize this game, which right now is a dead game. There's not many people on the subreddit. I think it might be like maybe 50 to 100 people on the subreddit actively, which is insanely low. And this is going to be an example of possibly where like a publisher is going to say, nope, axe it, move on, we'll chalk it up as a failure because it's going to cost too much money to try and breathe new life into this game.
And the people who are doing it with a passion are not going to do that. Even if the guy who led No Man's Sky was a bit of I'm trying to think of a word I can use on YouTube to describe him. I'm gonna
Misleading?
go with. I was gonna go with a television evangelist. But yeah. Um,
But like,
all right.
just
So
another point though, like Destiny 2, just when it launched, it was fun,
right,
and then it immediately nosedived because there was no end game. Now,
right.
initial sales were through the roof. Like Activision and Bungie made gangbusters. It was insane. And then the game wasn't selling that well after the fact because it was barren. And then Forsaken, the year two Comet expansion release, and Bungie was insanely pleased. Meanwhile, Activision was like, it made X dollars, but it wasn't as good as, say, the Call of Duty, which made 10 times X dollars, which
Right.
also just shows the disconnect between the developer and the publisher. The publisher has goals and they need to also appease their shareholders, whereas the developer is just like, hey, this game sold amazing and it did way better than we expected, and given the massive drop off of fans and players after a couple months of launch, it's awesome it rebounded like this.
Yeah, and I mean, I I have my own qualms with Bungie, but I would agree with you that it's awesome that they've gotten back on track and they're able to bring money home to their family. So I'm not going to bash that too much. So
Yep.
let's talk about what's next. We've talked about kind of the here, the now. We've talked about the past. What do we think is going to happen next in the realm of indie games? Do you want me to kind of start this off?
Let me start it off on a higher note.
Okay.
In my opinion, what would be beautiful is if big developers and publishers took inspiration from just the heart and soul that a lot of indie developers put into their games and took that and injected it into their own games and made their own games better and just more true, follow through on all of the promises. If the game needs to be delayed because it's too buggy, delay it, because a game that ships later but is better is going to be better remembered than one that ships and it's messed, it's bugged.
So is this the point where you're pausing so that I can inject a dose of reality, or do you want me to wait a second?
There goes my gravity. Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Sorry. So what I think is actually going to happen is big developers are going to try to steal ideas, make them more homogenous because they're all going to try to run with them. And if that doesn't work, they're going to try to buy out the indie developers to get that creativity in their ranks, not fully grasping that that creativity does exist in their ranks and it's been stamped out through competition and through corporate homogenization to try to raise profitability. Um, I think that's probably what's going to happen. I also think there's going to be attempts to corner markets that indie games usually would compete in, such as, say the phone market. You're seeing big names like Nintendo go in with things like Mario Run. You're seeing things like Pokemon Go show up on the market that are predominantly free games that use microtransactions and act almost identically to indie games, but they're put out and they're polished by AAA publishers, and it's almost like big beer companies going in after craft beer companies. First, they're
Well,
going to try to mimic. Pardon?
go ahead, sorry, I'll let you finish it up and I'll inject mine.
First, they're going to mimic, and if mimicking doesn't work, and kind of playing it off the fact that a lot of people don't fully understand what an indie publisher is versus a full-fledged publisher who has a smaller division, if that doesn't work, they're going to straight up start trying to compete them out of the market or buy them out of the market. And I think that's going to be difficult for indie games. I think having the big guy come in and put out games that are very similar to theirs from what they've learned from watching indie game success, and then having to deal with the concept of, hey, here's $1 million for you to get off the market or for you to come join us, is going to be a very difficult dilemma for these developers. I also think the market's going to get flooded, just like the craft beer industry, and you're going to have a lot of indie developers who fail because, not because they're good, but because there's just so many indie games, and you're going to start seeing repetition. You're going to see competition, and there just aren't enough people on this planet to be buying a new indie game a day, even if they only cost $5. Give us some of
Exactly.
your optimism, Aegis.
I know, I'm trying to be optimistic, you're the realist, but that's how I am and that's how you are. But what I was going to
Right.
say is, like, so, Kojima, mastermind behind, well, the PT, like the playable trailer for Silent Hill, Metal Gear Solid, he used to work for Konami, and Konami is largely investing in the mobile market. Meanwhile,
Right.
Kojima is just sees this mastermind. He can weave beautiful stories and fun games, and it basically led to him actually quitting Konami because he didn't agree with where the company was going. He's since started and made his own game, Death Stranding, and I'm not quite sure if Death Stranding would be considered an indie developed game, but I think technically it might. But it just goes to show that there are those still out there who don't want to cater to the masses, which will make more money. They still want to make a genuinely good product, which is, I believe, what Death Stranded was trying to do.
Yeah, and I would say that is a fair counterpoint, that there are going to be people in the industry and there are going to be people in the indie games who hold out either way and try to hold on to that old school nostalgia that we have for the older style of games that were more simplistic but were also more of a challenge, and that focus less on the number of pixels that they could fit on a screen and more on entertaining people.
It's actually
Um,
funny, like Konami on that point. I'm pretty sure Konami is the company behind Castlevania. Now, I think believe some of the developers wanted to make a new Castlevania game, but they couldn't, so they left and they made their own. I think it's called Bloodstained Ritual of the Night. And that's actually an indie game that I played on the Switch, I think last year, 2 years ago. That's a fun game. It's basically Castlevania without calling it Castlevania, but it's a 2D like 2D like platforming, dungeon crawling kind of game, bosses, etc. What you'd expect from Castlevania. Also a really fun game.
Yeah, and I think that's fair that you will see almost some of the flip of what I'm saying. You might see some indie game developers cave in and go over to big developers because they want more money, but you will also see some of the guys who folded and went over to that side years ago come out and start doing their own indie games because they've seen it's possible. And I think that might be a good segue into our last section, which is going to be relatively short, let's hope, because we only have 5 minutes left in this agreed recording. But what can we do to help indie games? I think they're in for a fight over the next 3 or 4 years for their survival. Aegis, what do you think we can do to help them continue to exist and continue to grow?
I think the obvious is to support them where they're deserving of it. Like if they have like a good game and they have microtransactions, and if it's free and you haven't supported them yet, then fire $5 then to get that skin for a character you like. But if you have the option to buy a full out game, buy the game because chances are it's cheaper, and if you're into the game or the company, they they are possibly deserving of the money. But I think more obviously is if you play a lot of big developed games and you're kind of sick and tired of just what they're pushing and just how it's mediocre content, don't support them further by buying microtransactions because cash shops are becoming way more common in games than they ever been before these days, and it almost sucks to see cash shops in a full-fledged, fully priced game when the cash shop is there. It almost seems like it takes away from like the gear, the loot, or the skins that could be in the normal game.
Now, as someone who's a bit of an outsider to gaming terms nowadays, Kasha is a basically a loot box style, right?
I've been
It,
saying cash shop though.
oh, okay. Sorry, I thought that there was something called a gacha game that
A gotcha
basically
game, yeah, that's a thing
yeah.
too, actually. Yeah,
I thought that's what you were saying was basically randomized loot boxes that make you want to keep going back. Continue. I
there's a
apologize. I was
there's
trying to
actually
help
a
educate.
Genshin Impact. I'm pretty sure that's a gotcha game where it's like you keep buying like chances to get like new heroes, but I haven't played that game, so I'm not really sure. But yeah,
Right. And I have only heard the term once or twice, so I was more looking to potentially educate the masses, including myself. But it turns out that's not what you were even saying. So
nope,
there you
go
go.
figure.
Um, so I would say I would add on to that a little bit that another good idea to support the development of indie games is to support modders. I find that a lot of indie game developers originally hail from the modding community, and it's kind of where they got their base to one get a few fans that would be willing to take a risk on buying their game, but also it gave them a chance to flex their skills and develop their skills. I would say to big publishers like Bethesda, it might be scary to let someone modify your Fallout game. I know that Fallout 4 had a lot more restrictions on modders, but come on, let let people learn, let people develop. It can only help to grow your industry, and a healthy industry has variety. It has competition. I think that the gamer and the producer should be supporting modders a lot more. It's how you develop some depth in your pool of inputs. Would you agree with that, Aegis?
100%. And like to even compound on that, there's a lot of times like let's take Halo Online for instance. Halo Online was a game that was developed from a Russian version of Halo 3 for computer and further expanded on to have a lot of like multiplayer and different skins. Now, I believe it's since been shut down, but 343 and Microsoft, I believe, worked with some of the developers and the modders of that community to make new skins to help port the MCC to PC. So I'm not saying that's a big thing to be hopeful for, but I say that's being a modder does have a lot of like good aspects with it, and good things that can come from it too. A lot of opportunity.
Yeah, and there you go. I mean, clearly, even the big guy saw the skill that was brought in from letting modders practice on their older games, right? Now, I would say, kind of one last small tidbit is continue to be vocal, everybody. Continue to stand against the parts of AAA games that are bad, but please remember, AAA games developers are generally still people who are trying to earn the bread for their table, and generally, especially the guys on the floor level who are developing the game, still very much care about the game they're developing and trying to put out for you. So don't just criticize the big games in general, only criticize the real wrongs that they're doing. Criticize especially the choices being made by upper management that are causing these issues. When you're supporting the indie games, be realistic. Give them realistic ratings. Don't just, support the bad name that some people put out about indie games by giving 5-star ratings to troll games that suck. Really try to give the fair ratings to original things like that Doji Doji Literature Club and other indie games like Happy Wheels that kind of put in the time to actually earn your money. Don't just support whichever one comes out, because that also doesn't help the public image of indie games. It doesn't help people to understand why they should try them.
In my
And at the
opinion,
same time,
oh,
yep.
sorry, my bad. Go ahead.
No, I'm pretty much done. I was rambling.
No, I was gonna say the biggest way to speak to this issue, especially the AAA games in the industry, is to speak with your wallet. If you're not a fan of X publisher doing Y thing, don't buy their latest game. And sometimes that's tough to do. I know I wasn't fully in agreement with, Pokemon Sword when it came out because a lot of the stuff they cut. So I didn't buy the game brand new. I bought it used off of, say, like Kijiji or like some kind of online marketplace where it sounds kind of like cheap, but it was kind of a way so I could support, like, to not support the developer directly, but still be able to play the game. You know what I mean?
No, I get it. And I think I understand why you'd want to do that. I mean, I know there's been a big push to continue to support having second and third wheel games or second and third use games for that exact reason, especially since a lot of developers are pushing to get rid of them because they want to make sure that that main point of sale continues to exist so they can keep making profits. I would tie that into what's going on with Magic the Gathering right now and how Magic the Gathering is attempting to cut out the middleman by selling their own premium cards at a high price. But that may be a topic for another day. Um, with that being said, I think we're pretty much at our time limit. And guys, just remember, support the little guy. The little guy is often the big guy of tomorrow. And don't forget, everyone involved in gaming tends to care about gaming. Don't be too mean. Don't dislike people who dislike different or who like and dislike different games than you. Accept it. If people prefer a AAA game, that's their prerogative. Don't judge them for it, and
I
don't
mean,
judge people who prefer.
worst case scenario, just 1v1 them on Lockout in Halo 2. Come on, that's how you settle the score.
Yeah, exactly. Go in and whip their butt 1v1, and then you can claim that you actually are the superior gaming race of, you know, I guess that would be computers, not consoles.
And you have to
Um,
teabag them, obviously.
Yes, of course. Okay, guys, we're going to cut it off at that. And what's next for us, Aegis? I think we're going to do some Let's Plays, or more specifically, you are going to do some Let's Plays, but me and you also plan on doing a Halo video.
I feel like we could do a couple of videos for Halo. Maybe some multiplayer stuff. I know you like SWAT, and I like SWAT for Halo 2. We could play some Halo 2 and 3. I'm gonna get back into doing some stuff for Destiny and airing some stuff there, and I would like to start playing Cyberpunk. I'm late to that party, but it also hasn't been crazy on my radar because I know it's still kind of in a buggy state, but I do still
Speaking of
want
the
to play
fall
that
of the
game.
great. Speaking of the fall of the great, eh? Oh my
Yep.
God, CD Projekt Red. Um,
I
how
cried.
did you fall so far? I still put that partially on the players, though, for demanding it be released. But it is what it is. I think that's going to be part of our Halo video as well, though. We're going to talk about how Halo Infinite can avoid being the next CD Projekt Wrecked.
Wrecked, exactly. The next No Man's
Okay.
Lie.
All right, guys. We're going to cut it off at that. Everybody, you have a good evening. You have a great week. Enjoy what's left of winter if you're like us and stuck in the snow. If you're not and you're in a balmy, warm place, know that we're envious. Aegis, you got anything left?
Nah, man, that's all. I'm good too. Thanks for tuning in, guys.
All right. Everyone have a good night. Bye now.
Peace.